This lecture will cover some of the difficulties when working with conditional statements. Conditional statements are particularly difficult because we can write conditionals in a number of different ways. And so we need to be able to put them in what is called standard form. Consider these two statements. If Marvin stays, then Nancy leaves. Or, Nancy leaves if Marvin stays. These are the same statement, but they look very different. The antecedent of the statement above in both cases is Marvin stays. However, what we need to be able to do is move the antecedent so that it is in the proper place. The antecedent needs to be the first thing in the sentence. So we need to always write our sentences like the first one, our conditionals like the first one. That's called standard form. So with the if at the front and then the then. But conditionals are tricksy. We have a lot of different ways to talk about conditionals, to say a conditional statement. So we have what is called necessary conditions. So if we say P is a necessary condition for Q, that gets rewritten as if P, then Q. Sorry, if Q, then P. The way to remember this is that necessary conditions come second. This is just a mnemonic. So P is a necessary condition for Q, so it comes second. It becomes the consequent. Then we have sufficient conditions. So if P is a sufficient condition for Q, then we can say if P, then Q. And we can remember this by remembering that sufficient conditions come first. So P is a sufficient condition for Q, so it becomes the antecedent. Then there is the phrase only if. So if we see the statement P only if Q, this gets rewritten as if P, then Q. Then there is the statement unless. So if we have P unless Q, that gets rewritten as if not Q, then P. Let's do some examples. So the Heat makes it to the playoffs only if the Hawks lose to the Cavs. So this is an only if statement. So we're going to leave the parts, the atomic statements here. The Heat makes it to the playoffs and the Hawks lose to the Cavs in the order they are. So we'll rewrite this as if the Heat makes it to the playoffs, then the Hawks lost to the Cavs. And so you'll see sometimes you'll have to switch tense when rewriting it as a conditional. So here's one with a sufficient condition. So this part that's the sufficient condition, you're having a quiz average over 90, will come first in the sentence. It will be the antecedent. So if you have a quiz average of over 90%, then you may be excused from the final. So here we have the settlement of the West could only take place if the Indian barrier were removed. So one temptation with this might be to write it as if the Indian barrier was removed, then the settlement of the West could take place. However, this only makes us have to stop and think. That's a disguised only if here. So sometimes the words only and the words if will be separated in the sentence. So we need to rewrite that as if the settlement of the West took place, then the Indian barrier was removed. Because if the Indian barrier wasn't removed, then the settlement of the West wouldn't have taken place. Because the settlement of the West took place only if the Indian barrier was removed. But here we have one that's an if only. Don't confuse that with only if. This just gets rewritten as if the president would promote Hannah, then she could save her company. So this if only, the only there isn't really doing any work.